Coming up on Bridge City News. The province urges protesters to get tested for COVID-19 after tens of thousands of people have converged to the streets for Black Lives Matter rallies. Plus, our local police commission weighs in on what a defunded police service would look like. And the body of the man whose death sparked worldwide protests is finally put to rest beside his mother.
Your nation. Your province. Your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News.
Hello, thank you for joining us. Albertans are going to have a lot more freedoms by week's end. The government plans to reopen movie theaters, gyms, pools, libraries, casinos, and churches on Friday. Premier Jason Kenney says the province has been doing well in its fight to slow the spread of COVID-19.
The last 3 tough months have left us bruised and grieving, in particular for the loss of 149 of our fellow Albertans. The deep economic and fiscal wounds will take some time to heal. But though we were bent, we have not been broken. In fact, we've come through it better than most, far better than most. Our health system was better prepared. Our response plan launched sooner and was more effective. Our citizens demonstrated great civic and personal responsibility, and our infection and hospitalization rates were much lower as a result. We were able to keep 96% of our economy functioning, 85% of businesses were able to continue operating, and our lives were not as severely curtailed as elsewhere. We've also been able to start lifting more restrictions sooner than elsewhere in Canada and across most of the democratic world.
Waxing hair removal services are part of Phase 2 of the Alberta government's COVID-19 relaunch strategy. As Micah Quinn reports, a local waxing service is hoping for a big turnout when they finally are able to reopen, and they say it'll be nice to get back to work and serve their customers.
Fuzzy Peach Wax and Beauty Bar, how can I help you?
Romany Wright is the owner of Fuzzy Peach Wax and Beauty Bar, and she says that the business is going to have a relaunch strategy when they reopen.
Some of the things that we will be doing is implementing the use of facial masks for team members and for our clients as well during all service procedures.
Plexiglass has also been installed at the front and at the nail desks.
We just have to take it up an extra notch to make sure that we keep everything really clean and sanitized and in between each client.
With the announcement today that the Alberta government has scheduled Phase 2 for June 12th, Wright says that the Fuzzy Peach Wax and Beauty Bar is scheduled to reopen at no later than June 19th.
We've received an overwhelming amount of support and love from our clients and from the community, and we're really happy to have our business here, and we look forward to being open.
Wright says Phase 2 is a good time to reopen, and that a Phase 1 relaunch would have been a little bit risky. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Thank you, Micah. Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health is urging protesters who were at recent anti-racism rallies to get tested for COVID-19. Dr. Dina Hinshaw says people should be tested even if they don't have symptoms. About 10,000 people took to the streets in Edmonton on Friday as a part of anti-racism rallies, and there have also been numerous rallies and marches in Calgary. Hinshaw says while case numbers and hospitalizations remain low, the province can't risk letting complacency allow the infection rate to rise again.
This weekend, we saw many people participate in demonstrations to speak out against racism. I want to commend all those who wore masks and stayed 2 meters away from others while showing up to rally in support of this cause. The freedom to protest is a critical one, and yet we face a challenge in this time of pandemic to do so without risking super spreader events. I want to encourage all those who attended protests this weekend to go for COVID-19 testing whether or not you have symptoms. Contact tracing would be extremely difficult in large crowds such as this, so please also be mindful of your actions in the coming 2 weeks. Pay particular attention to staying 2 meters away from others and wearing a face mask if that is not possible. I have reached out to some of the organizing groups with an invitation to talk about how future protests might be able to be structured to reduce the chance of COVID transmission. As we start to see small increases in cases in some of our communities, we need to think creatively about how we hold space for voices that need to be heard, while not risking the low case counts that we have collectively worked so hard to achieve.
The province has confirmed 3 additional COVID-related deaths, bringing the total number of lives lost to 149 in Alberta. Over the weekend, Alberta Health was alerted to a number of cases linked with Safina Foods in Edmonton. 6 cases were confirmed. All cases and close contacts are isolating at home. 6,698 Albertans have recovered from coronavirus, leaving 355 active cases. 44 people are hospitalized, with 6 in ICUs. And the province wants to make sure Albertans have easy access to personal protective equipment while out in public. That's why they're making non-medical masks extremely accessible. Pretty much anywhere in our province, there are Tim Hortons on every corner. So while you're out making your morning coffee run or while at various A&W and McDonald's locations, you can pick up some free face masks for you and your family, courtesy of the provincial government.
I mean, a lot of people certainly need them. As the phases open and social distancing, and we are and you are going to be in situations where you can social distance. You go to the mall, you go to the park, maybe you go to the grocery store. Here's an opportunity. The provincial government are using us as a venue to hand these out for free. It's exciting that realize that what we can take in capacity. We reach a lot of people every single day, and we're ready to go.
You can only get the masks by using the drive-through in order to avoid too many people inside the store. Alberta's Justice Minister Doug Schweitzer says changes are coming to the Police Act after rallies were attended by thousands of Albertans. The protests followed huge demonstrations in the U.S. over the death of George Floyd during an arrest in which a white police officer kneeled on his neck. Anti-racism concerns in Canada include an allegation by a First Nations chief in Alberta of police brutality. And while Alberta is set to modernize its Police Act, many around the country are saying that all law enforcement should be publicly defunded. Lethbridge Police Commission Chair Simon Griffiths says that the public's reaction stems from protests in the United States. Griffiths adds that defunding the police in Lethbridge would be a terrible move.
I think it would be detrimental to public, if you're talking about Lethbridge specifically, it would be detrimental to public safety and protection. Our police service has certainly got a really good record of dealing with the public, and our particular police service places a lot of emphasis on training, and we have highly trained police officers, and they're subject to recurrent training. Our police service in our city perform a function of protecting the public and responding to calls, and I think that we have to make sure that we don't lump all police services in the same basket, if you will.
And south of the border, that same statement, defund the police, is appearing on more signs during demonstrations in Washington, D.C. over the death of George Floyd. But not every protester fully agrees with the broad, often misinterpreted phrase.
I'm not sure about the abolishing the police. We do need protection, but my thing is if we can weed out the bad and bring in the good, then I prefer that. I want to be able, if I need them, to call them, but I want them to also be at the mind frame that they're going to keep us safe, that they're not going to come in and harm us or kill us.
But the definition of defund the police, what does it actually mean? Does it mean disband the police department completely? Will there be 0 police officers in the city afterwards? That's not what it means to me necessarily. It just means, to me, it means rethinking the union contracts.
So what would a defunded police society look like? Our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daktari paints a fairly dark picture.
it goes without saying. This is the year 2020, and when we have this much violence and looting and lawlessness, this is anarchy. What is the go-to move? What is the action to cut back on that? I just think of this one scene when I saw a gun shop that was looted and raided, and all those guns were stolen. And imagine how many more guns got into the wrong hands, and now we're going to cut back on police funding. I think this is all more steps in the wrong direction.
Catch the entire interview with Lisa Daktari coming up in the second half of our show. Family and friends of George Floyd said their goodbyes today at a private funeral and burial in Houston, where the 46-year-old spent most of his life. The black man's death at the hands of Minneapolis police May 25th has inspired global calls to end racial injustice. He has been memorialized at several public events attended by thousands. Floyd's body was carried home in a horse-drawn carriage and will be laid to rest next to his mother. Floyd called out to her as he was dying as a white police officer pressed his knee into the handcuffed man's neck for several minutes. A Lethbridge man has created a petition in opposition to Pathway 24, which would see a 3-kilometer pathway and stairs built over an existing trail in the coulees. Bryce Nugent is the creator of the petition, and he says that this opposition is not just from a group of athletes, but that it's coming from the general public.
As users of this trail, we're using it with our families. I've got a 5 and 7-year-old son and daughter, and they're using this trail all the time. It's being made out as being for extreme athletes and being challenging terrain. It's a great area. It's accessible to kids. It's accessible to a lot of people. We keep hearing the term equitable access. The Pathway 24 project that's being proposed is not giving equitable access either. It's still got steep staircases, still has challenging terrain, so we just don't see why there's a need for this pathway.
The project would cost the city $1,700,000. As of today, the petition has over 2,000 signatures. A 25-year-old man is in police custody after a robbery of a Circle K convenience store in Medicine Hat. Police got the call at 3:45 this morning, and the suspect was apprehended within half an hour. He is facing charges of robbery, uttering threats, and breach of probation. He remains in custody awaiting a bail hearing. 6 people were sent to hospital after an explosion involving a fifth-wheel trailer at a northern Alberta campground. Emergency crews were dispatched to the Martin River Provincial Campground about 25 kilometers north of Slave Lake early yesterday. RCMP say the injured, ranging in age from 6 to 41, were all from the same family and suffered serious but non-life-threatening injuries. The cause of the blast is under investigation. The Manitoba Liberal Party says it wasn't aware a photo existed of one of its candidates in blackface when he ran in last year's provincial election. Liberal President David Engel says that David Teffin is no longer involved with the party, but Engel was unable to say how the photograph went undetected during vetting of prospective candidates. A Facebook account that put up the photo said it was from either 2015 or 2016, and that Teffin was dressed up as the actor and comedian Bill Cosby. Teffin wrote in a social media post what he did was completely unacceptable and that he will deeply regret it for the rest of his life. Jagmeet Singh says it was hypocritical for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to take a knee during Friday's anti-racism demonstration in Ottawa. He says while the PM was doing that, his government was drafting a bill that would fine or imprison people who made fraudulent claims under the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. The NDP leader says his party will not support the bill as is. Singh says the proposed bill would hurt the very people that the CERB was designed to help, vulnerable people who have faced financial hardship because of COVID-19.
The government's own spokespeople, MPs, like the parliamentary secretary, Adam Vaughan, were out on Twitter telling people, just apply, don't worry. We had Minister Qualter saying, no, people won't be penalized. And they supported our motion in the House, which said that no one would be unduly penalized. Despite all of this on one hand, and the Prime Minister taking a knee, they wrote a bill that as far as we know right now, the details put out right now, is one that's going to criminalize someone retroactively for applying with massive fines and potentially jail time.
Meantime, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says people who made legitimate mistakes when making claims under the Canada Emergency Response Benefit won't face consequences, but he says his government will punish those who are deliberately trying to game the system during the pandemic.
We knew at the same time that there would be mistakes made, good faith, honest mistakes that we would need to clean up afterwards and make sure that people paid back if they got both the wage subsidy and the response benefit, for example. And there's no harm, no foul on that if it's an honest mistake. But unfortunately, we also knew that, as with any system, there would be a very small minority, as I pointed out, of people who deliberately try to take advantage of the system.
With many billions of dollars being spent on COVID-19 aid programs, the Conservatives say Auditor General Karen Hogan's office needs a budget increase to monitor the Liberals' actions. Tory critics Tim Uppal and Pierre Poilievre say they're making the demand formally through House of Commons committees.
With unprecedented levels of spending in the midst of this global pandemic, the accountability and transparency afforded by the Auditor General has never been more crucial. Canadians deserve to know that their tax dollars are being spent properly and that they are getting the most out of their money. Yet, even with the newly appointed Auditor General, Karen Hogan, has stated that resource constraints are going to put a strain on her ability to deliver on their mandate. To be blunt, this is unacceptable.
A New York City police officer seen on video violently shoving a protester to the ground, sending her to hospital, has been charged with assault, criminal mischief, harassment, and menacing. Officer Vincent De Andrea was suspended without pay last week. Similar recent interactions between police and demonstrators have led to a series of criminal justice reforms in New York, including a bill to ban chokeholds by police, named for Eric Garner. The black man died in 2014 after being placed in a chokehold during an arrest. Well, looks like we have a pretty sunny week ahead of us. We could even see temps rise into the 30s finally. We will give you all the weather details right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Here's a look at our weather forecast for Lethbridge. Into tonight, we're going to be seeing partly cloudy skies. It will be clearing overnight, though. We're going to see a light gust of winds, 30 kilometers per hour. At times, it will gust to 50, though. Overnight, low 9 degrees. Into tomorrow, clear skies, sunshine, 22 degrees. The UV index tomorrow will be 8 or very high, and then the overnight low on Wednesday evening, 9 degrees as well. As we look further into the week, beautiful week ahead of us. Look at this, sunshine on Thursday, 26 degrees is the high. Now check that out for Friday. We could be seeing a high of 31 finally. Sunshine expected on Saturday as well, with a high of 24, and 22 is the high for Sunday with partly cloudy skies. Not a bad weekend ahead of us. And into next Monday, 22 also with partly cloudy skies. Now, as we look into that 5-day forecast, we see those temperatures rising. And as we look at the almanac, the average high for this time of year, 22. So we're definitely reaching that and getting beyond it. 8 degrees is the low. 33 degrees is the record high, but that was back in 1956. The low was 2, that was in 1950. Now that sun rose this morning at 5:24 a.m. and our Tuesday evening sunset 9:37 p.m. giving us exactly 1 minute more of daylight than we had yesterday as we start creeping towards that summer solstice. Now let's take a look at what's happening across the nation, starting with the West Coast. Showers expected tomorrow in Victoria and Vancouver. Vancouver could see a risk of a thunderstorm. 19 is the high there, 18 in Victoria, 22 in Edmonton. Nice day up there, sunshine. Sunshine also expected for Calgary with a high of 20 degrees. As we look further into the prairies, Saskatoon could see a risk of a thunderstorm tomorrow as well. High 21. 21, same thing for Regina. As that pressure changes, they could see it turning into some lightning and thunder there. Mix of sun and cloud expected. Some showers there in Winnipeg, high of 19. Toronto's high 31. They are having a heat warning. Lots of humidity there as well, as that's building into a possibility of a thunderstorm. Same thing for Ottawa, high 28, 29 the high over in Montreal. And they could see a possibility of some showers. Fredericton's high 23, mix of sun and cloud. 17 expected in Charlottetown. Halifax 21, mix of sun and cloud there. They could see an overnight frost warning though. Same thing for Charlottetown. St. John's, Newfoundland could see some drizzle tomorrow with a high of 9 degrees. There you go. That is your forecast. Well, after serving 7 years as governor of the Bank of Canada, Stephen Poloz is joining the board of directors at technology and consulting firm CGI Inc. The company has also named Mary Powell, former president and chief executive for Green Mountain Power, to the board. CGI Executive Chairman Serge Godin says the two will provide valuable perspective and insights as the company continues to expand its business globally. U.S. employers laid off 7.7 million workers in April after an even grimmer March as the COVID-19 pandemic shuttered offices, restaurants, stores, and schools. The Labor Department also says the number of available jobs in April fell 16% from March to 5 million, and hires declined 31% to 3.5 million. The job losses follow 11.5 million layoffs in March and suggest the U.S. economy could take time to recover after nearly a decade's worth of gains vanished in 2 months. The U.S. government said last Friday that 2.5 million jobs were added in May and businesses started to reopen, but those gains appear to reflect temporary layoffs, employees returning to work rather than an economy at full throttle. And now here is a look at today's markets.
The TSX was down 141 points today to 15,883. The Dow was down 300 points to 27,272. The S&P 500 was down 25 points to 3,207. The Nasdaq was down 29 points to 9,953. Oil was up 20 cents to $38.39 per barrel. Natural gas went down 3 cents to $1.59. Gold was up a penny to $1,715.34 an ounce. Silver was up 2 cents at $17.56 an ounce. Wheat is at $257 per metric ton. Barley is at $243. Canola is at $462. Corn is at $229 per metric ton. Live cattle were up $2.20 to $96.80. Feeder cattle were also up $1.18 to $134.88. Lean hogs were down 50 cents to $48.58. And the Canadian dollar was slightly down on the day to 74.52 US.
Recapping one of our stories this hour, federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is lashing out at legislation that the Trudeau government plans to introduce tomorrow. He says it would hurt vulnerable people the most by imposing fines or prison terms for people who made fraudulent claims under the CERB benefit. But Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says no one will face consequences for making honest mistakes when they applied for CERB. Coming up, our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daktari weighs in on what the country might look like following the defunding of police services. That is coming up right after this short break. Stay with us. We are going into 2 weeks now of protests following a lot of unrest across the United States and much of the world last week. Here to speak more on the subject is foreign affairs expert Lisa Daktari, joining us from Los Angeles. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us again today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you on our show. So, Lisa, in your opinion, how long do you think these protests could possibly go on for?
You know, symbolically, I think the organizers of the protests would love for this flame to continue burning, but we hope, fingers crossed, that the more violent and emotional parts of the protests that included the riots and the looting are over and behind us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here in Los Angeles, we had a lion's share of that, the protest, the violence, the damage to so many of our commercial areas, so many big stores and mom and pop shops had their stores demolished. So we're hoping that we have peaceful protests ahead, and although they're dwindling, I think that we're going to still see little pockets pop up here and there.
Yeah, for sure. Now, are curfews still being imposed in your area and across the states, and are people abiding by them?
Yeah, so it seemed like in cities like New York, Los Angeles, parts of Chicago and Dallas, they had trouble enforcing a lot of the curfews. In New York and Los Angeles both, they ended the curfews over the weekend, and now we're hoping that, again, we have peaceful times ahead.
Yeah, hopefully, like you said, fingers crossed, right? Now, Lisa, last week a small town police chief was killed. It was a retired Black police captain named David Dorn. And to me, this seems so ironic. How does his Black life not matter? Was it just because he was a police officer?
It looks like, a lot of these protesters went out there blindly, meaning that they were so emotionally charged with the killing of George Floyd that they were just tasked with destruction, looting, rioting, and not understanding the damage that they were causing to Black-owned businesses and white-owned businesses and Latino-owned businesses. I mean, if we're talking about not seeing color or respecting all color, the damage that was done was, targeted towards the wrong people. And, I think there's a segment of the population that says you can't tell people who are so hurt how to grieve. Well, when it's infringing upon the rights of others, we can tell them not to do that, to be lawful, not to kill police officers, not to, go after this innocent retired officer who was helping protect a pawn shop that belonged to a friend of his. So, we have all kinds of stories. And again, all lives matters. Of course, right now it's Black Lives Matter because they are a grieving society, a race. And at the same time, we're hoping that all across the world, people see eye to eye on this, that there is no room for hatred or murder or looting when it comes to understanding one another on this platform.
Mm-hmm. And I believe charges have been laid in that case?
Yes, they found the 24-year-old perpetrator who allegedly murdered the man. Again, he was protecting this pawn shop. They found him on the sidewalk dead. Again, so charged with going in there and just taking what they wanted that they didn't really understand what they had to do, to beat up people and to kill people. And, ironically, as you said, the individuals, the handful of individuals who died in the looting happened to be African Americans, many of them. So, there's a lot of irony here. And again, I think there's a lot of pain, but a lot more pain has been brought about as well.
Mm-hmm. So very, very sad. Now, speaking of police, now the Minneapolis City Council is vowing to disband the police department. And I'm seeing that it's also happening in New York City. Are you able to comment on that?
This is what Americans do. We have an issue and we go so overboard and so extreme to the other end of this issue. So for example, now instead of addressing the fact that these officers who were involved in the murder of George Floyd, I don't know anybody who's watched that video and said, yep, that man deserved to die. No, it was excessive force, and this happens. And, psychologically speaking, you have police officers who are, drawn to a career of using force in order to make people follow laws to a certain extent. That doesn't give them the right to murder, doesn't give them the right to overuse that power, but you always find the individuals that do. And instead of addressing this towards those individuals, we're now going to cut funding from such an important part of our lives. What do you do when someone robs your home? What do you do when you, God forbid, get raped or there's violence there? I mean, it goes without saying. This is the year 2020, and when we have this much violence and looting and lawlessness, this is anarchy. What is the go-to move? What is the action to cut back on that? I just think of this one scene when I saw a gun shop that was looted and raided, and all those guns were stolen. And imagine how many more guns got into the wrong hands, and now we're going to cut back on police funding. I think this is all more steps in the wrong direction, an undoing or an unraveling of our republic, and it's so sad to watch.
Exactly, and just thinking of what a world would look like without a funded police department, because they're even talking about having that happen up here now. It's amazing how it just spreads like wildfire.
Exactly, and I wanted to just say that this, the George Floyd protests and just the conversations around this George Floyd situation has sparked protests, riots in 4 continents. So it is from, across the world, in Australia, in Germany, in France, in London. It has truly sparked the conversation to say, do we cut back on police funding? I grew up thinking, well, if something bad happens, you go find a nice police officer. And I think that has changed very much so. Particularly in certain communities where they're taught to fear and hate the police. And again, this situation is awful. This, what I'm saying is not a pass towards Derek Chauvin or any of the officers who were with him, but is to say that this is an exception and we should see it as that. And all the other cases are exceptions and we should see it as that. And talk about all the police officers who do such wonderful work every single day, day in and day out, when they risk their lives on the front line. So, this is, again, it's a handful of scenarios, and that they're taking over our, ability to think through this logically.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a few bad apples are just ruining it for everybody. And then here we go again too. The Minnesota governor is launching a civil rights probe into the Minneapolis Police Department. Can you talk about the significance of this? I think this is the first time anything like this has happened.
Yeah, this is the first time anything like this has happened. But, at the same time, there are so many eyeballs on this case. And, the police force here, the police department, really has to go, and they upped the charge from 3rd degree to 2nd degree murder. They brought in the other individuals who were just standing there and observing this murder, which is a good thing. I think that they are responsible and they should be all brought in. But the fact that there will be multiple investigations, this is to calm the masses, to say that we are doing everything we possibly can to make sure that this doesn't happen again, to make sure that this culture of police brutality is not a thing. And again, it's the micro macro. This is a micro case. We're turning it into a macro problem. And I hope that the police officers across the country aren't penalized for this. I hope that people don't disrespect police officers. And I hope that we don't change the establishment of if the police officers out there that would do this, will they really change based on this slap on the wrist or this investigation? Or I don't know. I truly don't know the answer to that. But I don't want there to be this overarching kind of black cloud over all police officers that really risk their lives to give us so much more security and safety, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And then another thing that's being, sparked from this too is all the protests, all the people gathering together when we've been told not to for so long. So Lisa, do you believe that more of the virus will emerge because of what's happening now with all these protests?
We'll know more than 2 weeks. We'll know exactly. There was a story about one of the National Guard members that was sent out to Minnesota actually tested positive. Also, if you've heard, George Floyd tested positive. I'm not insinuating that that's how he died or why he died. He was murdered, but he happened to have COVID. Now, going back to that, this is just one word that comes to mind. It's hypocrisy, right? So, we hear, the country has to be shut down. We totally took down, our entire economy here in the United States, as they did in other places in the world, but our numbers were extremely high. We had many cases, and we have about 110,000 deaths at this point. But did it warrant, taking down putting a complete halt on our economy and saying that we cannot go out there or we have to socially distance ourselves and wear masks. And now all of a sudden, the left is encouraging people to go out there and to protest. So, when these things happen, what does an ordinary citizen think to themselves? Well, this is a lot of hypocrisy. What am I to believe? And if I can't trust the government, telling me what the reality of the situation is, what's the truth? Is COVID going to kill me or not? Do I need to be, cautious or not? Do I have to wear a mask or not? What are the real answers? And the bottom line, Jeanette, is that we are in an election year. And when that happens, very sadly, it's very difficult to get straight answers out of anyone. There are agendas on both sides, and unfortunately, people's lives, their health, it's all on the line.
Oh, incredible. Now, you mentioned election year, so interestingly enough, we're going to talk about Trump for a second. So last week, President Trump made an example of Washington, D.C. by pulling in the National Guard and mobilizing military personnel around the district to police demonstrations. So D.C. obviously doesn't have the same rights as states to reject the National Guard or other troop deployments, right? So what did we see happen there compared to other states, and did it work, in your opinion?
Yes and no. I think that wherever the National Guard was brought into, in Los Angeles included, we saw a real quick decline, a real quick declimaxation of what was going on. I think just the presence of the National Guard, I can speak, because I was here, in person, seeing what happened in Los Angeles, just the presence of, the uniformed personnel or the trucks that they brought in, it was helpful. It was helpful in understanding that there was, an extra layer of protection because the police were told to stay back and stand down. In Washington, we also had a lot of emotional protesters, particularly around the White House. Donald Trump for the very first time was taken down into a bunker, which is, it's historic to think that the life of the president and his family were at risk because of these protesters. Look, they're relentless. And you have to really think about what Donald Trump symbolizes in all of this. To many, he is the symbol of racism and homophobia and anti-Semitism and all the isms. If you look at the facts, it's quite the opposite. Unemployment for the Black community, rights for women. Look at his own daughter and his own wife as examples of leaders. How many women he's hired in his cabinet. How many bills he signed into action for the Jewish community and anti-Semitism. He just wrote another bill signed another bill combating anti-Semitism and BDS. So, it's very difficult to argue with facts when you are up against so much emotion in this country. And that is exactly what the left has done. They are fueled with all of this emotion. They have community organizers, and they have, they're using that intersectionality to their benefit, meaning all these different social justice movements have kind of piggybacked on one another to say it's because our president is a bigot, so we're allowed to do whatever we want. And it could be, they'll embed themselves in the gay pride parade, they'll embed themselves in Black Lives Matter, they'll embed themselves in the Women's March. There is so much hatred in all of these movements that are supposed to bring about more freedom, more human rights. It's unfortunate, but again, we're in an election year, Jeanette, so anything goes, and it's very, again, at the expense of the American people. And I know that it has a ricochet effect into Canada, into Europe, into other parts of the world. So it's quite significant to keep our eyes on what goes on in Washington.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to watch it from afar as well. It looks like, Lisa, we're out of time here. I could go on talking to you all day, honestly.
Likewise.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
My
here.
pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeanette.
Well, most of us are really hoping someone will come along with an effective vaccine for COVID-19 really soon. But the reality is vaccines generally take about 18 months to develop. But there is possibly a faster way to do this, although it comes with some controversy. Today's guest is going to tell us what could be part of the solution. Josh Morrison is one of the team leaders with One Day Sooner. Hello, Josh. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, can you give our viewers a snapshot of what One Day Sooner is all about?
Yeah, so we're a group that advocates for people who are interested in participating in what's called a human challenge trial. And what that means is it's a way of testing a vaccine that instead of just giving someone a vaccine and letting them go out into the normal population, seeing if they'll be infected, you actually deliberately expose them to infection, and that way you can test it a lot quicker. And so that's what we're interested in exploring, whether that would be a good idea.
Right. Now, can you explain how the human challenge trial works? I assume that first you find candidates or volunteers, right? And some of them are given the trial vaccine while others are getting a placebo, and then others actually get the dose of COVID-19 virus. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So it's exactly like a normal clinical trial for what's called efficacy, to figure out if the vaccine works. So that's usually what's called phase 3, and usually it takes, if you're trying to go really fast, maybe 6 or 7 months, but often more than that, and it has thousands or even tens of thousands of people. And like you said, you give half the group the vaccine and half the group a placebo, or maybe another vaccine or something like that you're testing against. With the challenge trial, it works the same way. You give both halves the vaccine and the placebo, but then you have them come to a sort of medical facility where they'd be isolated and given medical care, and then they take like a nasal spray or something like that that has the virus in it, and which will infect people who are unvaccinated. And hopefully, the idea is that it's calculated not to give serious disease to the extent possible. And hopefully what happens is the people who are vaccinated, far fewer of them show symptoms than people who weren't vaccinated, and that's how you test that the vaccine works. And you can figure that out within a few weeks or a month of starting that exposure, whereas for a regular trial, it might take many more months than that.
That's so interesting. So once they're done with the isolation period, what kinds of testing will be done on the health of these individuals?
That's a good question. So they'll remain in isolation for several weeks until they've had several tests to make sure they're definitely not infectious, have no more of the virus, their health is back to normal, everything like that. So there's not going to be any possibility of reinfecting the community in any way or things like that. Now, after the fact, we would expect to have kind of longer-term follow-up and things like that to make sure that these people are getting the best health care possible, and any conditions that came up because of their brave acts, are going to be treated as well as we possibly can.
So to what degree could this potentially speed up the timeline to get a vaccine out there?
Well, it's hard to say. There are some experts that propose kind of replacing those traditional, quote, phase 3 trials, those sort of 6-month trials, with these, which might take maybe 2 months or so once they're set up, although it takes some time to get these challenge trials ready, because they wouldn't be ready today. So in that world, maybe you could save several months. And there is precedent for doing that, where the vaccine that Americans use for cholera when they're traveling abroad, called Vaxchora, was developed using a challenge trial to prove that it was effective. But I think that's a little bit unlikely that you're going to replace those trials altogether. Instead, what I think we should expect is, if this works, maybe it could save maybe as much as a month of a vaccine, because you would get sort of the information you get out of a challenge trial is very useful, but it's not perfect. It's not a perfect replacement for that phase 3, because the people who participate in a challenge trial are young and very healthy to minimize their risks, and they're getting the virus in an unusual artificial way from like a nasal spray. So I would say, if things go well, a month could be a realistic goal for these challenge trials, though some experts have proposed even longer than that, as many as 3 or more months.
Right, but that's still very soon compared to the 18 months, obviously. So obviously part of this debate would be whether it's ethical to intentionally infect someone with COVID-19, right?
Right, and that's, it's obviously an important question, and no one is underestimating or underplaying the risks to these volunteers. But at the same time, we think that if there are young and healthy volunteers, these risks would be around the level of childbirth or kidney donation, which are things that, are definitely significant risks and are real meaningful choices, but are also things we commonly allow people to do. And the benefits would be significant. So we feel like if there are willing and well-informed volunteers who want to take this risk, and it looks like there'll be a meaningful improvement in vaccine development, even bringing things 1 day sooner, we think would justify doing this.
Yeah,
ethically.
and I'm sure that there's others that believe that this, in fact, might be morally required under the current circumstances, right? So you got two schools of thought there.
Yeah, I think and there's actually a paper, the World Health Organization just issued a report, I believe yesterday, that looked at these questions and came up with a set of criteria for how you would actually evaluate whether challenge trials would go forward. And I think, there's some things I disagree with, and there's some comments I made that I wish they had taken. But I think generally it's a pretty good report, and it's definitely something that's, I think, reasonably positive about challenge trials overall. And there's actually another piece coming out today by a number of bioethicists in the journal Science about challenge trials that's also fairly supportive. So I do think from an ethical perspective, there's a decent amount of support for this. I will say that, practically, it's going to be, there are some difficulties in actually creating these challenge trials, and it's going to take some time. And that's why we need to be doing everything we can today to be preparing these challenge trials so that if we are going to use them in 6 months, they're ready and available to be used.
Now, if the human challenge trials aren't allowed to move forward, I guess we have to ask the question, how many lives could be lost because of the delay, either from COVID-19 or deaths from the effects of isolation and delayed surgeries?
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously very uncertain, what things are going to the world's going to bring in 3 months or 6 months, or especially 18 months when a vaccine might be kind of actively being deployed. And so anything that we can say is sort of a guess. And also, again, we'll just say that there's a world in which challenge trials shouldn't move forward because they won't work, right? And that is a possibility. And so we do have to recognize that. But that said, if you think about what does 1 day of vaccine deployment mean? One very, very rough estimate I use is I say, well, let's say that 1 out of 6 people in the world are going to get infected with COVID-19 every year. And let's say that a vaccine could save, let's just say 0.2% of those people from dying, right? So 1 in 500 of those people from dying. That would save about 7,000 lives per day and tens of thousands of lives per week, hundreds of thousands per month. So obviously that's an enormous effect. And that's why we need to do everything we can to prepare these and make sure they're available if they're going to be a good option.
Now, I'm curious, how many candidates do you have at this point? And do you have any idea as to when the government will give the okay for these trials to start?
So we've actually had as many as 14,000, more than 14,000 people sign up on our website who are interested in doing this. And they've come, it's really a global effort. People have come from more than 100 countries. And I will say that the United States has a number of volunteers, more than 4,500 last we checked, but actually is only number 2 in the world. So Brazil has over 6,500 volunteers. So it's been really incredible. Now, to your question about when the government might do this, this is something we're working on. We've been talking to people at the NIH, and we've been talking to Congressman Bill Foster, who's a champion of this and is a scientist himself. And so we're trying to secure funding in the next stimulus bill to pay for this preparation so it can move forward as quickly as possible.
Wow. And now what kinds of people are volunteering? I'm just so curious about them. What age groups do you have and what are their backgrounds?
Yep. And so I'll say first, we haven't done a kind of formal statistical analysis of this group yet. So the things I'm about to say are just impressions based on the reasons people have given for volunteering. What we find is it seems like most of our volunteers are probably between ages 20 and 35 or so, which makes sense because that's likely roughly the group of who's going to be eligible to do this. Though there are older volunteers, and I find their stories very touching because they often say, I know this is a greater risk for me, but it might be, more worthy for science, and I want to move forward and do it. The other thing I would say about our volunteers, and again, who mostly in that younger age range often talk about that they're in good health, they also seem to be quite well educated. I think most of them are probably kind of young professionals or have some graduate education, graduate school, things like that. And often a lot of them have like a medical or public health or biomedical sort of background. And so they're kind of interested in these topics before. The last thing I'll say is that there are a number of volunteers, certainly not the majority, but a noticeable group who have military service and see this as being aligned with that, which I think makes a lot of sense.
That is so interesting. You mentioned hearing some of their stories. What are some of the stories that you are hearing from them? Why are they volunteering? I mean, you kind of explained that a little bit, but
yeah,
I'm just curious.
So one that really touched me, there's a number of different inspiring stories, and I actually print out really that I kind of read some kind of randomly and print out some of the ones that really connect with me. One that made me cry when I read it was someone who had been in an accident a few years ago that they had lost part of their leg. And it really affected their life and really hurt their life. And they said they wanted, they knew that maybe they'd be ineligible because of this or because they were a bit older. But they really just were completely passionate about doing this because they wanted to be useful. They wanted to be making a difference. And this person had a 13-year-old daughter and wanted to do it for her. And so that was one that really touched me.
That is touching. So how much of a health risk are these volunteers realistically being exposed to?
Mm-hmm. So, one thing I'll say, and one of the things that's daunting about this and makes it, a significant decision, is there's some real uncertainty. It's a very new disease. We're learning new things every day, and hopefully we'll learn more, by the time that it happens. But our best available data is that if you look at people ages 20 to 29, basically the risk of death in that group from COVID-19 is about 1 in 3,000. And that's including both people who are healthy and who have pre-existing conditions. And so with the challenge trial, you'd be removing people who have pre-existing conditions. And so that, if you look at, for example, the statistics from New York City, deaths between people 18 and 45, something over 80% of those deaths are people with pre-existing conditions. So the risks are real, but by comparison, about 1.5 in 10,000 women die during pregnancy. So this is kind of, I think, roughly on par with that. So significant, but also, when people are pregnant, we don't think like, oh, I better, say my goodbyes because, you might not be here. So it's real. But it's also, within a level of risk that we accept in other circumstances.
And if the trial is successful, will there possibly be some testing done on volunteer healthcare workers to put, those that are basically in a higher risk category, to put them into a higher risk testing phase, so to speak?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways you could do this. You could select people for the trials based on people who had high risk before, like a healthcare worker or like someone who was in an area with widespread disease. So that's one thing that you could do. Another thing, is that's an alternative people have proposed to challenge trials, and I think it's a useful thing to be doing either way, is to conduct some of these clinical trials among healthcare workers. So for example, there's actually a phase 3 trial now of a tuberculosis vaccine that they're trying to see if it works for COVID as well. And that's being tested in about 5,500 healthcare workers in Australia and the Netherlands. To be clear, that's not a challenge trial, that's a more conventional trial.
Now, some are suggesting that intentionally infecting healthcare or healthy volunteers, rather, with low doses of the COVID-19 virus could help create herd immunity. which could potentially make the pandemic easier to manage. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think of that as a very separate proposal to what we're saying, and I don't really have particularly intelligent thoughts. What we're describing is something that is testing a vaccine and is being done, by medical professionals with the highest standard of care, with an enormous amount of preparation. I haven't seen anything like that among the other approach of trying to get immunity or things like that. So I just see them as very, very separate.
Okay, and how are volunteers, how are you finding the volunteers? You mentioned earlier that they're actually finding you, right?
Right. Yeah, and I'll say that we're described sometimes as a group that recruits volunteers, but I don't think that's quite right, because it's not. We're not trying to make a hard sell to people and say, hey, you should do this. We think that it's something that some people feel called to do and feel inspired to do, and that's the way I felt about it. And so I think people hear about us, and some people want to sign up, and that's how people have been finding us. Our job isn't to try to grab volunteers. Our job is to try to represent those volunteers and advocate for them, basically making sure that if challenge trials are going to be useful, we do everything we can to make them happen, while at the same time making sure that they don't happen if they're not going to be helpful, or if the risks are unreasonable compared to the benefits. So we're trying to advocate for those volunteers, but our goal is not necessarily to try to get as many people as possible to do this. We think it's something that if it feels like the right decision, that's wonderful. And if it doesn't, it's certainly not for everyone, and we would never, try to
of course. Right.
sneak
Yeah.
someone
Thank
into
you for
volunteering.
clearing that up too. Josh Morrison, thank you so much for being on our show. We really appreciate the information here.
All right. Thank you for having me.
All right, that is Josh Morrison. He is one of the team leaders with One Day Sooner. On behalf of all of us here at BCN, thank you for watching.